The candlelight in the ballroom of Ashcombe Hall flickered against crystal glasses, and Eleanor Whitfield heard the words that would change everything before the music even stopped. She had stepped behind a velvet curtain near the terrace doors to escape the heat of the room, her wineglass still cool in her hand. She had not meant to listen. She had only wanted a moment of quiet before she returned to the crowd that watched her every move, as though she were a painting hung slightly crooked on a wall. But the voice on the other side of the curtain was unmistakable. It belonged to Julian Ashcombe, the man she was to marry in 4 weeks. "She is convenient," Julian said, his tone light, almost amused. "Her family needs the money, and mine needs the land her father still owns. That is all this marriage will ever be. You must not worry yourself over her, Margaret. She bores me. She always has." A woman laughed softly in reply, a laugh Eleanor recognized at once, though she wished with her whole chest that she did not. Margaret Vale had been a guest at nearly every gathering that season, always dressed a shade too fine, always seated a little too close to Julian at dinner. Eleanor had told herself it meant nothing. She had told herself many things that meant nothing. "You are cruel," Margaret said, though she did not sound troubled by it. "I am practical," Julian answered. "There is a difference. Once the marriage is settled and her father's debts are cleared, I will have what I need. What happens after that is my own business." Eleanor did not move. She did not gasp or drop her glass or make any sound at all. She simply stood behind the curtain, the fabric brushing her shoulder, and let the words settle over her like cold water poured slowly down her back. 4 weeks. She had spent months preparing for a wedding that was never meant to be a marriage at all, only a transaction wearing a white dress. She thought of her father, who had aged 10 years in the last 2, who sat up late at night with ledgers he thought no one saw him crying over. She thought of her mother, who had died believing Eleanor would be cared for, would be safe, would be loved. She thought of every dinner where Julian had smiled at her from across the table while planning, apparently, to despise her for the rest of their lives. The curtain swayed gently as someone passed nearby, and Eleanor stepped out from behind it before she could be discovered listening. She walked back into the ballroom with her spine straight and her chin level, the way her mother had taught her to walk into any room, no matter what waited inside it. Julian found her 20 minutes later near the refreshment table, his face arranged into the same warm smile he always wore in public, the smile that had once made her believe she was fortunate. "There you are," he said, taking her hand and pressing it briefly to his lips. "I was beginning to think you had abandoned the party." "I would never," Eleanor said, and she meant it in a way he could not possibly understand. She let him lead her to the center of the room, where the other guests had gathered to toast the coming wedding. Someone handed her a fresh glass of wine, the liquid a deep ruby red beneath the chandeliers. Julian raised his own glass and began to speak, something about fortune and partnership and the joining of 2 fine families, and the room applauded, and Eleanor smiled. She smiled the way she had been taught to smile since she was a girl of 6, learning to sit still through hours of lessons on posture and needlework and the proper way to greet a duchess. She smiled the way a woman smiles when she has decided, in the space of a single held breath, that she will not give anyone in this room the satisfaction of watching her break. She set down her glass on the nearest table, the crystal making a soft, deliberate sound against the polished wood, and she looked at Julian with an expression so calm, so gently pleasant, that he did not notice anything had changed at all. "To us," he said, lifting his glass toward her once more. "To us," Eleanor repeated, and there was nothing in her voice to suggest that she had already begun, in her mind, to leave him. The rest of the evening passed as though nothing were wrong. She danced with the elderly Baron Whitcomb, who told the same story about his hunting dog that he told at every party. She complimented Lady Fenwick's new gown. She accepted congratulations from women who envied her, and men who pitied her father for needing this match so badly. Through all of it, she wore her soft, unbothered smile, and no one in that glittering room suspected that the woman before them had just watched her entire future dissolve like sugar in warm water. It was only when the carriage finally returned her home, well past midnight, that the smile fell away. Eleanor sat alone in her chamber with a single candle burning on the table beside her bed, and she did not cry. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something colder and steadier settle into her chest, a clarity she had not felt in months. She understood now, with total certainty, what her life would become if she walked down that aisle in 4 weeks. She would spend her days in a house with a husband who found her dull, who kept a mistress with his family's blessing, who had already decided, before their marriage even began, exactly how little she was worth to him. She thought of her father's debts, and how her marriage was meant to erase them. She thought of the shame that would fall on her family if she refused the match now, this close to the wedding, with invitations already sent and gowns already fitted. She thought of every argument that told her to stay, to endure, to be practical as Julian claimed to be. And then she thought of something else. She thought of the small inheritance left to her by her mother's sister, a modest sum that had been sitting untouched in a bank in a town 2 days' ride from here, meant for Eleanor alone, in her own name, should she ever need it. She had never planned to use it. She had assumed her life would follow the path already laid out for her, the path every woman of her station was expected to follow without question. She rose from her chair and crossed to the wardrobe, moving quietly so as not to wake the house. She pulled out a single trunk, smaller than the ones the servants used for her wedding trousseau, and she began, with steady hands, to fill it with only what she truly needed. A few plain dresses, her mother's letters, a small portrait of her parents from years ago, before the debts and the desperation had aged them both so cruelly. She left behind the jewels Julian had given her, the fine gowns meant for a wedding that would now never happen, the life that had never truly belonged to her in the first place. By the time the candle had burned low, the trunk stood packed and closed by the door, and Eleanor sat by her window watching the dark sky for the first hint of gray that would mean morning was near. She thought of her father, sleeping down the hall, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly changed her mind. But she reminded herself of what she had heard behind that curtain, of the casual cruelty in Julian's voice, of a lifetime spent being someone's convenient arrangement rather than someone's true choice. She would write to her father once she was settled somewhere safe, somewhere far from Ashcombe Hall and its glittering hollow promises. She would explain, in time, why she could not stay and marry a man who had already told the world exactly how little he valued her. For now, there was only the waiting, the watching, the slow turn of the sky from black to the palest edge of blue. When the first birds began to call outside her window, Eleanor rose, lifted her trunk, and walked quietly down the back stairway, past the kitchen where the servants had not yet risen, and out into the cool morning air. She did not look back at the house that had never truly felt like home, not since her mother died and her father's fortune began to crumble, not since every decision about her life had been made by someone else, in rooms she was never invited to enter. She walked to the edge of the estate, where a hired carriage waited exactly as she had arranged 2 days earlier, when she first began to suspect that something about Julian's affections did not add up. The driver, a quiet man named Edmund who asked no questions and required only fair payment, helped her load the trunk and offered his hand as she stepped inside. "Where to, miss?" he asked. Eleanor looked back one final time at the outline of Ashcombe Hall against the brightening sky, at the life she was leaving behind without a single word of explanation to the man who had promised to marry her and never intended to love her. "Away," she said simply. "As far as this road will take me before sunrise ends." The carriage pulled forward, wheels turning steadily over the gravel drive, and Eleanor Whitfield did not look back again. She kept her eyes forward as the hall shrank behind her, its tall windows still dark, its gardens still asleep. Somewhere inside, her father would wake in a few hours to an empty room and a folded letter she had left on her pillow, a letter that said only that she was safe, that she needed time, and that she loved him more than her silence could ever explain. She had written a dozen versions of that letter through the night, tearing up each one that sounded too much like an apology, until she found words that felt honest instead of ashamed. The road stretched long and pale in the half-light, bordered by hedgerows still wet with dew, and Eleanor watched the countryside slide past the carriage window, as though she were watching someone else's life begin. She thought of the wedding gown hanging untouched in her chamber, the invitations already sent to families across the county, the quiet scandal that would ripple through every drawing room within a week. She thought of Julian, waking to discover his convenient arrangement had slipped through his fingers on the very morning he assumed her cooperation was guaranteed. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that, something closer to relief mixed with grief, as though she had set down a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was not simply part of her own body. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the choices ahead of her belonged entirely to herself. Edmund glanced back at her once, his expression carefully neutral, the look of a man who had driven enough desperate passengers to know better than to ask more questions than necessary. "There is a coaching inn 2 hours from here," he said. "You could rest before deciding your next road." "2 hours will do," Eleanor answered. "After that, I will decide the rest." She turned her face toward the window again, watching the last edges of night dissolve into morning, and allowed herself, finally, to breathe. The coaching inn smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread. and Eleanor Whitfield sat alone at a corner table with a cup of tea, slowly growing cold in her hands. She had not eaten since the night before, since the toast Julian raised in front of a room full of witnesses, and yet she found she had no appetite for the porridge the innkeeper's wife had set before her. Her mind was elsewhere, tracing backward through the months that had led her to this narrow wooden bench, in a town whose name she barely knew. It had begun, as so many things did in her family, with numbers that no longer balanced. Her father, Edward Whitfield, had once managed a modest but comfortable estate, land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. But poor harvests, a failed investment in a shipping venture, and the slow decline of an old man's judgment had eaten through their savings within a few short years. By the time Eleanor turned 20, the Whitfield name carried more debt than dignity, and every conversation in their house eventually circled back to money they did not have. The Ashcombe family had offered a solution that seemed, at the time, almost like mercy. Julian's father wanted land that bordered the Whitfield property, land with access to a river crucial for trade. Eleanor's father owned exactly that land, and exactly nothing else of real value. A marriage between the two families would settle both problems at once. The Ashcombes would gain their river access through the marriage settlement, and the Whitfields would receive enough money to clear their debts and keep their remaining land. No one had asked Eleanor whether she wished to marry a man she barely knew. It was simply explained to her, gently but firmly, over a dinner where her father could not meet her eyes. "He is a fine man," her father had said. "Good family. Good prospects. You will want for nothing." Eleanor had wanted to ask whether wanting for nothing included wanting to be loved, but she had learned long before that such questions were not welcome in rooms where survival was being negotiated. So she had agreed, the way daughters of families like hers were expected to agree, and she had spent the following months learning to smile at a man whose affection, she now understood, had never been real at all. She thought of the early days of their courtship, how Julian had seemed attentive, even charming, bringing her small gifts and complimenting her needlework in front of his mother. She had allowed herself, slowly and carefully, to hope that perhaps this arrangement might grow into something warmer over time. She had seen other marriages begin as transactions and become, eventually, true partnerships. She had believed, foolishly, that hers might follow the same path. But there had been small signs, she realized now, looking back with clearer eyes, the way Julian's attention would drift when she spoke of anything beyond fashion or gossip. The way he introduced her to guests, as though listing an item on an inventory, rather than a woman he intended to spend his life beside. The way Margaret Vale always seemed to appear at the same gatherings, always seated close enough to Julian, that their conversation felt private, even in a crowded room. Eleanor pushed the cold porridge aside and looked out the inn's small window at the road beyond, where a farmer's cart rattled past loaded with hay. Somewhere behind her, hours away now, her absence would have been discovered. She could picture it clearly, though she was not there to see it. Her lady's maid, Bethany, would have entered her chamber at the usual hour with a tray of chocolate, and found the bed already made, the wardrobe missing its smaller trunk, the letter propped against the mirror where it could not be overlooked. Bethany would have run for the housekeeper, and the housekeeper would have gone straight to her father, and within the hour the entire household would have known that Eleanor Whitfield had vanished before sunrise. Her father would read the letter first in private, she imagined, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. She had written that she was safe, that she needed time away from a marriage built on lies she could not yet explain, and that she loved him too much to become a bride to a man who had already confessed, in his own words, that she meant nothing to him. She had not named Julian's cruelty directly in the letter, not wanting to give her father a weapon that might be used carelessly in anger. She had simply asked for patience, and time, and trust that she would return with explanations when she was ready to give them. Whether her father would honor that request was another matter entirely. At Ashcombe Hall, the news would spread differently. Julian's family, Eleanor suspected, would not allow the truth to surface easily. A runaway bride was scandal enough to damage both families, but the truth behind her running would damage the Ashcombe name far more severely than a simple case of nerves. She imagined Julian's mother, a sharp and formidable woman named Constance, already crafting the story that would be told to neighbors and relations alike. That dear Eleanor had taken ill suddenly, that the wedding would be postponed while she recovered her health, that no one should trouble themselves with worry or gossip. It was, Eleanor thought bitterly, exactly the kind of practical solution Julian himself would have suggested. Control the story, protect the family name, let the truth wait quietly in a locked room, while a more convenient version walked freely through society. She finished her tea, though it had gone entirely cold, and rose from the table to find Edmund waiting near the inn's entrance, his hat already in hand. "You've decided then?" he asked. "I have," Eleanor said. "There is a town on the coast, 3 days from here. Millbrook, I believe it is called. My aunt once mentioned it in her letters, before she passed. I have enough from her inheritance to live modestly there for some time, under a different name, until I understand what my life is meant to become now." Edmund nodded slowly, without the surprise she half expected. Millbrook is a fishing town. Quiet. No one asks too many questions of strangers there, so long as they pay their way and keep to themselves. "That suits me," Eleanor said. They traveled through the remainder of that day and into the next, stopping only when the horses required rest, and Eleanor spent the long hours watching unfamiliar countryside roll past her window, turning over the pieces of her old life like stones she was setting down one by one. She thought of the friends she was leaving behind, women who would soon hear whispers of her disappearance, and wonder what madness had taken hold of quiet, obedient Eleanor Whitfield. She thought of her father's failing health, and the guilt that sat like a stone in her chest whenever she considered how her absence might worsen it. But she also thought, with growing clarity, of what her life had truly offered her before that curtain, before those cruel words spoken so carelessly by a man who believed no one was listening. She thought of years stretching ahead of her as Julian's wife, raising his children in a house where his mistress was tolerated as an open secret, where her own opinions and talents would matter less than her usefulness as a bridge to a piece of land. She thought of growing old in that house, invisible, unloved, convenient. By the second night, as the carriage rattled along a coastal road with the sound of distant waves growing steadily louder, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine, for the first time, a different kind of future. Not a grand one, not one filled with riches or revenge, simply a life that belonged to her, built by her own hands, answering to no one's convenience but her own survival and, perhaps eventually, her own happiness. She did not know yet what waited for her in Millbrook. She did not know that a modest fishing town would offer her not just shelter, but purpose, and eventually, a man who would look at her the way Julian never had, as though her presence in a room was a gift rather than an arrangement. She knew only that she had chosen, for the first time in her adult life, to walk toward something uncertain, rather than remain inside something safe and cruel. And as the carriage crested a hill and the wide gray sea opened up before her, stretching endlessly toward a horizon she had never seen with her own eyes, Eleanor Whitfield felt something inside her chest loosen, just slightly, for the first time since that night behind the velvet curtain. The sea did not care who she had been at Ashcombe Hall. It did not know her family's debts, or her broken engagement, or the scandal already spreading through drawing rooms she would never enter again. It simply rolled and crashed against the distant shore, patient and endless, waiting for whoever arrived on its edge to decide who they might become next. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cool glass of the carriage window and watched the water grow closer, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself hope. Back at Ashcombe Hall, though Eleanor could not see it, the morning had unfolded exactly as she had feared. Bethany had discovered the empty chamber just past 8 o'clock, the tray of chocolate still balanced in her hands, and her first instinct had been to check the small sitting room next door, certain Eleanor had simply risen early. When she found that room empty as well, and the wardrobe missing its smaller trunk, a cold understanding had settled over her, and she had hurried through the corridors calling for the housekeeper in a voice that cracked with alarm. Edward Whitfield had been in his study when the housekeeper reached him, reviewing papers he could no longer afford to ignore, and the letter she carried had trembled visibly in the older woman's hand. He read it twice before he fully understood its meaning, and then he had sat very still for a long moment, staring at his daughter's careful handwriting, feeling something between panic and a strange, unwelcome relief that he could not yet name even to himself. He had suspected, in the quiet hours of his own doubt, that Julian Ashcombe was not the man his daughter deserved. He had seen the way Julian's eyes moved past Eleanor in crowded rooms, the way his compliments always sounded slightly rehearsed. But he had needed the marriage settlement too desperately to voice those doubts aloud, and now, holding proof that his daughter had needed to escape a life he had arranged for her, the guilt threatened to swallow him whole. He did not send for the magistrate. He did not organize a search party to comb the countryside, as some fathers might have done. Instead, he folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat, close to his chest, and sat with his own failures for the better part of an hour before he finally rose to face the household staff waiting anxiously outside his door. At Ashcombe Hall itself, the reaction was colder and far more calculated. Julian received the news mid-morning while reviewing correspondence with his father, and his first expression, according to the servant who delivered the message, was not concern but irritation, as though Eleanor's disappearance were a scheduling inconvenience rather than the collapse of his entire arrangement. "She has run," he said flatly, setting down his pen. "Foolish girl, where does she imagine she will go?" His mother, Constance Ashcombe, entered the room within minutes of hearing the news herself, her face already composed into the mask of quiet authority she wore whenever the family's reputation was at stake. She did not ask whether Eleanor was safe. She did not ask why a young woman on the edge of her own wedding might choose to vanish before sunrise rather than walk down the aisle. She asked only one question, and asked it twice, until she received a satisfactory answer. Who else knows? The staff who had discovered the empty chamber were quietly instructed that Miss Whitfield had taken suddenly and severely ill, a delicate condition requiring rest and privacy away from society for some months. Letters were drafted within the hour to neighboring families, explaining the postponement of the wedding with careful, sympathetic language designed to invite concern rather than suspicion. Julian himself was instructed to appear publicly only briefly over the following days, wearing an expression of gentle worry that suggested a devoted fiancé anxious for his beloved's recovery, rather than a man whose true feelings toward that same woman had driven her from the estate entirely. It was, Eleanor would later learn, a performance so smooth and so quickly assembled that most of the county believed it without question. Only a handful of servants, sworn to silence under threat of losing their positions, knew that Miss Whitfield had not fallen ill at all, but had simply walked out of the house before dawn with a single trunk and never returned. Margaret Vale, for her part, showed no outward change in behavior, though she was seen at Ashcombe Hall with increasing frequency in the weeks that followed. Her presence explained away as comfort offered to a grieving family during a difficult time. Few questioned why a family in mourning over a fiancé's sudden illness required quite so much comfort from a young woman who was not, by any official account, related to them at all. None of this reached Eleanor as she traveled toward the coast, though she guessed at much of it with an accuracy that would have surprised her had she known how close her imagination came to the truth. She understood the Ashcombe family well enough after months of dinners and courtship to know exactly how they would manage a scandal, smoothing over the cracks in their story with wealth and confidence, until the truth simply stopped mattering to anyone outside a small circle of servants too afraid to speak. What she could not have predicted was how quickly her own absence would begin to unravel threads she had never noticed tangled together. Without the marriage settlement secured, whispers began circulating among the Ashcombe family's creditors, questioning whether the promised river access and accompanying funds would ever materialize. Julian's father, already stretched thin from investments of his own, found himself fielding uncomfortable questions from men who had extended credit based on an alliance that no longer seemed guaranteed. But all of that lay in Eleanor's future, unseen and unknown, as her carriage finally rolled to a stop at the edge of Millbrook, where narrow cobbled streets sloped down toward a harbor filled with fishing boats, and the sharp, clean smell of salt water hung thick in the evening air. She stepped down from the carriage on unsteady legs, her body aching from days of travel, and looked out at the small, unfamiliar town that was about to become her home. Somewhere behind her, a life built on lies continued without her, its cracks slowly widening in ways she could not yet see. Ahead of her lay only uncertainty, a rented room she had not yet secured, and a name she had not yet chosen to replace the one she was leaving behind. Eleanor Whitfield took a breath of salt air and stepped forward into whatever came next. 2. Millbrook smelled of salt, tar, and drying fish, and for the first 3 days, Eleanor barely left the small rented room above a bakery near the harbor. She spent the hours staring at cracks in the ceiling, replaying the sound of Julian's voice behind the curtain, wondering whether her father had recovered enough to eat properly, wondering whether she had made the bravest decision of her life, or the most foolish one. It was hunger, in the end, that forced her downstairs on the 4th morning. The bakery's owner, a stout woman named Marjorie Holt with flour permanently dusted across her forearms, looked up when Eleanor entered and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You're the one renting the room above," Marjorie said. It was not a question. "Yes," Eleanor answered. "My name is Ellen." She had chosen the name during the final hours of her journey, close enough to her own to answer to instinctively, distant enough to leave Eleanor Whitfield behind at the edge of the county she had fled. "Ellen," Marjorie repeated, weighing the name as though testing its honesty and deciding, apparently, not to press the matter. "You look like someone who hasn't eaten a proper meal in days. Sit." Eleanor sat, and Marjorie placed a warm roll and a cup of tea before her without being asked, and for reasons Eleanor could not fully explain. That small, unasked-for kindness nearly brought her to tears. No one at Ashcombe Hall had ever offered her anything without calculating what they might receive in return. Here, in a bakery that smelled of yeast and wood smoke, a stranger had simply noticed she was hungry and fed her. "You'll be wanting work, I expect," Marjorie said, settling onto the stool across from her. "A woman traveling alone with a trunk and no husband in sight usually is." Eleanor considered lying, considered inventing a story about a husband lost at sea, or a family visit extending longer than planned. But something about Marjorie's plain, unbothered manner made deception feel unnecessary. "I need to support myself," she admitted. "I have some savings, but they will not last forever, and I would rather not spend my days worrying about when they run out." "Can you keep accounts?" Marjorie asked. "Numbers, ledgers, that sort of thing?" It was, Eleanor realized with something close to surprise, one of the few genuinely useful skills her strange upbringing had given her. Her father, in the years before his fortune truly collapsed, had insisted she understand the estate's finances, believing a well-educated wife would be an asset to whatever family she eventually married into. She had spent countless afternoons reviewing ledgers alongside him, learning to spot errors, to balance columns, to understand where money moved and why. It was a skill Julian's family had never once asked about, too concerned with her appearance and her manners to wonder whether she possessed a useful mind. "I can," Eleanor said. "I managed my father's household accounts for several years." Marjorie's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well then, my cousin runs the harbor supply office, keeps track of what comes in and out on the fishing boats, payments to the crews, that sort of thing. His last bookkeeper married and moved inland last month, and he's been drowning in unsorted papers ever since. I could put in a word, if you're interested." Eleanor accepted before she had fully considered what accepting might mean, and within a week, she found herself seated in a small office overlooking the harbor, sorting through months of tangled receipts and payment records for a man named Walter Pratt, who ran the supply office with more enthusiasm than organization. The work was tedious in places, but Eleanor found something deeply satisfying in the slow process of untangling chaos into order, of watching numbers finally align after days of confusion. It was through this work that she first encountered Captain Henry Doyle. He arrived at the supply office on a gray Tuesday morning, his coat still damp from the sea, requesting payment for a shipment of fish delivered the previous evening. Eleanor, reviewing the ledger, discovered immediately that the payment owed to him had been recorded incorrectly, shorted by nearly a third due to an error made months before her arrival. "This isn't right," she said, more to herself than to him, frowning at the columns of figures. "I noticed the same thing 3 deliveries ago," Henry said, leaning against the doorframe with the patient weariness of a man who had grown used to being short-changed and simply too busy to fight about it. "Walter's a good man, but numbers were never his strength." Eleanor spent the better part of an hour tracing the error backward through months of records, finally locating the mistake, a simple transposition of 2 figures that had compounded steadily over time. When she presented Henry with the corrected sum, along with the back payment owed to him, he studied her with an expression she did not immediately recognize, having so rarely encountered it in her previous life. It was respect. "Most people would have simply apologized and moved on," Henry said. "You actually fixed it." "It seemed the honest thing to do," Eleanor said, somewhat startled by the simplicity of his gratitude. Over the following weeks, Henry Doyle became a regular presence at the supply office, arriving each time his boat returned from the water, always polite, never presumptuous, treating Eleanor's corrections to his payments with genuine appreciation, rather than the dismissive tolerance she had grown accustomed to from men of Julian's circle. He was not a wealthy man. His hands were rough from years of hauling nets, and his coat had been mended more than once at the elbows. But he listened when she spoke, truly listened, asking questions about her opinions, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. She learned, slowly, that he had inherited his boat from his father, that he supported an aging mother and a younger sister still finishing her schooling, that he had never married, because he had never found a woman who seemed to want more from him than his labor could provide. He asked Eleanor, one afternoon as they walked along the harbor after her work was finished, what had brought her to Millbrook alone, without family, without explanation. Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much of the truth she was ready to share. "I left an arrangement that was not honest," she said finally. "A marriage that was meant to solve my family's problems rather than build a genuine life. I discovered, before it was too late, that the man I was meant to marry felt nothing real for me at all." Henry was quiet for a long moment, watching the waves roll against the harbor wall. "That took courage," he said eventually. "Most people stay inside arrangements like that. It's easier than starting over with nothing." I did not feel courageous, Eleanor admitted. I felt terrified. I still do, some days. Terrified and courageous aren't opposites, Henry said. Seems to me you can be both at once. It was a small conversation, ordinary in most respects, but Eleanor found herself thinking about it for days afterward, turning his words over in her mind, the way she once turned over columns of figures, searching for hidden meaning and finding, this time, only simple honesty. As the weeks passed, Eleanor's life in Millbrook began to take a shape entirely her own. She earned her own wages for the first time, modest though they were, and felt a fierce, quiet pride each time she deposited them into a small account under the name Ellen Marsh, the surname she had finally chosen after weeks of feeling incomplete without one. She rented a slightly larger room above the bakery, decorated it simply with items she had purchased herself, and began, for the first time in her adult life, to make decisions about her days that answered to no one's expectations but her own. She made friends among the fishing families and shopkeepers, women who worked hard and spoke plainly, and judged her not by her family's name or her father's debts, but by her willingness to help when help was needed. She discovered a genuine talent not just for bookkeeping but for organizing the chaos of small business affairs across the town, and soon found herself assisting not only Walter Pratt but 2 other harbor merchants who had heard of her careful, honest work. Meanwhile, though Eleanor could not see it from her small corner of the coast, the world she had left behind was beginning to shift beneath the weight of its own deceptions. The story of Eleanor's sudden illness had held for a while, but stories built on lies rarely survive prolonged scrutiny, and small inconsistencies began to surface. A distant cousin visiting Ashcombe Hall grew suspicious when she was denied even a brief visit to the supposedly ailing bride. A servant, dismissed for an unrelated matter, spoke carelessly at a local tavern about what she had truly witnessed that morning, about the missing trunk and the letter left for Edward Whitfield. Rumors, once planted, proved far harder to control than Constance Ashcombe had anticipated. Worse still, without the marriage settlement finalized, the river access the Ashcombe family desperately needed for their shipping ventures remained legally tied to Edward Whitfield's land he had no intention of surrendering now that his daughter's engagement had collapsed under circumstances even he was beginning to understand more clearly. Creditors who had extended generous terms to Julian's father based on the promised alliance grew increasingly impatient, and whispers of financial trouble began to circulate through the same drawing rooms that once whispered admiringly about the Ashcombe family's fortune. Julian himself grew increasingly frustrated as the weeks stretched on without resolution. Margaret Vale, sensing perhaps that the arrangement she had once found so amusing was growing more complicated than she had anticipated, began distancing herself from Ashcombe Hall, unwilling to attach her own reputation too closely to a scandal that showed no signs of resolving quietly. None of this news reached Eleanor directly, isolated as she was in her new life by the coast, but she felt, in some instinctive way, that the ground beneath the world she had left was no longer as steady as it once appeared. She did not know the details, could not have guessed at the precise unraveling taking place hundreds of miles away, but she sensed, in the growing confidence of her own new life, that walking away had cost her something real, but had also, perhaps, cost the people she left behind far more than they had ever expected to pay. For now, though, Eleanor allowed herself simply to live. She woke each morning to the sound of gulls and the smell of Marjorie's fresh bread. She spent her days balancing ledgers that finally made sense, correcting years of small errors that no one before her had cared enough to notice. She spent her evenings walking along the harbor, sometimes alone, sometimes with Henry Doyle beside her, learning slowly what it felt like to be valued, not for what she could provide, but simply for who she was. It was not the life she had imagined for herself as a girl, dreaming of grand houses and titled husbands. It was smaller, plainer, built from her own 2 hands rather than inherited from a family name. But it was, for the first time Eleanor could remember, entirely and unmistakably her own. That fragile peace was tested one afternoon in late autumn, when a merchant's carriage rolled into Millbrook carrying goods from further inland, and among its passengers stepped a face Eleanor recognized instantly, one that nearly stopped her heart where she stood. Lord Cedric Farrow had been a guest at Ashcombe Hall on more than one occasion, a distant associate of Julian's father who traded in fine cloth and had once complimented Eleanor's needlework at a dinner party months before her disappearance. He stood now outside the Harbor Inn, adjusting his gloves, entirely unaware that the woman ducking quickly behind a stack of fishing crates 20 feet away was the very bride whose sudden illness he had heard whispered about across 3 counties. Eleanor's pulse hammered as she pressed herself against the rough wood of the crates, watching Farrow through a narrow gap between the slats. He was speaking with the innkeeper, arranging a room for the night, his voice carrying easily across the quiet harbor street. She could not risk him seeing her clearly, could not risk word traveling back to Ashcombe Hall that Eleanor Whitfield, supposedly recovering from illness in some unnamed sick room, had instead been spotted very much alive and very much employed in a fishing town on the coast. She remained crouched behind the crates for nearly 20 minutes, her knees aching, her breath shallow, until Pharaoh finally disappeared inside the inn. Even then, she did not move quickly. She kept to the narrow back lanes on her walk home that evening, her hood drawn low despite the mild weather, glancing over her shoulder more times than she cared to admit. She told no one but Henry what had happened, finding him at the harbor the following morning as he checked the ropes securing his boat. "A man from my old life," she said quietly, her voice tighter than she intended. "He didn't see me, I think. But if he had, if word traveled back to the family I fled, I don't know what would happen. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything." Henry set down the rope in his hands and studied her with the same steady attention he always offered her, patient and unhurried. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Leaving, I mean. Even now, seeing how close that old life still follows you?" Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. "No," she said. "I regret the fear. I regret that a part of me still flinches at faces from that world, but I do not regret choosing this life instead." "Then let the fear pass through you," Henry said simply, "and keep choosing this life anyway. Fear doesn't get to make your decisions for you, not unless you let it." His words settled something in her chest that had been coiled tight since the moment she recognized Pharaoh's face. She realized, standing there on the harbor with the smell of salt and rope thick in the air, that Henry Doyle possessed a quiet wisdom entirely unlike anything she had encountered in Julian's circle, where every conversation seemed calculated to impress rather than to comfort. In the days that followed, Pharaoh's carriage moved on without incident, continuing further along the coast toward business Eleanor never learned the details of, and her life in Millbrook resumed its steady, comforting rhythm. But the encounter left its mark. She began keeping her hood raised more often on days when unfamiliar carriages passed through town, and she found herself listening more carefully to news carried in by travelers and merchants, hungry for any word of what was happening at Ashcombe Hall, even as she dreaded what she might learn. It was Marjorie, of all people, who eventually brought her the first real news from that world, having heard gossip passed along by a traveling cloth merchant who frequented both Millbrook and the towns closer to Ashcombe territory. "There's talk," Marjorie said one evening, setting a plate of stew before Eleanor with unusual care, "that the Ashcombe family's finances aren't what they once were. Something about a marriage that never happened properly, and debts that were meant to be settled by it. The merchant said half the county's whispering about a scandal they can't quite name outright." Eleanor's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Do they speak of the bride?" she asked carefully. "The woman who was meant to marry into that family?" "Only that she took ill and never recovered enough for the wedding to proceed," Marjorie said, watching Eleanor's face with an expression that suggested she suspected more than she let on. Strange illness that. Lasting this long without a word of her recovering, or worsening, or anything at all. Eleanor said nothing further on the matter, but she carried Marjorie's words with her long after the meal was finished, turning them over with a mixture of vindication and unease. The lie Constance Ashcombe had constructed to protect her family's reputation was beginning to crack under its own weight, exactly as Eleanor had suspected it eventually would. She did not know yet how those cracks would widen, or what it might mean for her own carefully rebuilt life when they finally did. For now, she simply continued forward, one steady day after another, building something real in a town that had asked nothing of her except honest work, and had given her, in return, something she had never truly possessed at Ashcombe Hall: the simple, powerful freedom to be entirely herself. Winter arrived early along the coast that year, and Millbrook slowed under gray skies and colder winds. But Eleanor's life, far from slowing with it, only grew fuller with purpose. Her work with Walter Pratt had expanded steadily, and by the season's turn she managed not only his accounts but those of 2 additional harbor merchants, her reputation for honesty and precision spreading quietly through the small business community that kept the town alive. She had also, without quite intending it, become someone the other women of Millbrook turned to for advice. A fisherman's widow, struggling to understand the debts left behind by her late husband, sought Eleanor's help sorting through tangled paperwork that had overwhelmed her for months. A young seamstress, hoping to open a small shop of her own, asked Eleanor to help her understand how to price her work and track her earnings properly. Eleanor found herself, almost without noticing the transformation, becoming a quiet fixture of trust within a community that had known her for less than a year. It was a strange and welcome contrast to the life she had left behind, where her worth had been measured entirely by her family name, her appearance, and her usefulness in a marriage contract. Here, in Millbrook, she was valued for her mind, for her steady hands and careful attention, for the simple fact that she showed up each day and did honest work well. Her relationship with Henry Doyle deepened slowly through the winter months, built not on grand declarations but on small, steady moments. He would stop by the supply office after long days on the water, sometimes bringing a fish too fine to sell, insisting she take it home for her supper. She began joining his family for occasional meals, sitting at a table with his mother and younger sister, sharing simple food and simpler conversation, feeling for the first time in years what it meant to be welcomed somewhere without conditions attached. Henry's mother, a sharp-eyed woman named Agnes who missed very little, remarked one evening as Eleanor helped clear the table that she seemed different from most women who passed through Millbrook. "You carry yourself like someone who's had to learn how to survive," Agnes said, not unkindly. "There's a steadiness in you that doesn't come from an easy life." Eleanor considered how much to share, and found, increasingly, that she trusted this family enough to offer pieces of the truth. "I left a life that wasn't honest," she said. "A marriage arranged for reasons that had nothing to do with love. I couldn't stay inside it any longer." Agnes nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Takes real courage, walking away from security into nothing at all. Most people choose the misery they know over the uncertainty they don't." "I nearly did choose the misery," Eleanor admitted. "If I hadn't overheard the truth so plainly, I might have married him anyway, telling myself it was practical." "But you didn't," Agnes said simply. "That matters more than you might realize." As the months passed, Eleanor's talent for organization drew attention beyond the harbor merchants. A local magistrate, hearing of her reputation, asked for her help untangling records related to a dispute over fishing rights between two families, a task requiring both careful bookkeeping and diplomatic patience. She handled the matter so effectively that word of her skill spread further still, and by early spring, Eleanor Marsh, as she was now known throughout Millbrook, had become something she never imagined she could be in her old life. A woman respected for her competence, sought after for her judgment, valued for exactly the qualities Julian Ashcombe had once dismissed as boring. Meanwhile, far from the coast, the world Eleanor had left continued its slow unraveling, though the details reached her only in fragments carried by traveling merchants and occasional letters from her father, who had finally begun corresponding with her once she felt safe enough to share a discreet address through Marjorie's cousin in a neighboring town. Her father's letters revealed a household in growing turmoil. The story of Eleanor's mysterious illness had held for nearly 6 months, but persistent questions from concerned relatives, combined with the Ashcombe family's failure to produce any concrete timeline for her recovery or the rescheduled wedding, had begun eroding public confidence in Constance Ashcombe's careful narrative. Whispers grew louder. Some now openly speculated that Eleanor had simply refused the match, embarrassed the Ashcombe family, and been quietly hidden away somewhere to avoid further scandal. The financial consequences proved more severe than the social ones. Without the marriage settlement finalized, and with Edward Whitfield showing no inclination to surrender river access to a family whose son had so callously discussed his daughter behind a curtain, the Ashcombe family's shipping ventures stalled entirely. Creditors who had extended generous terms based on the promised alliance grew impatient, then hostile, calling in debts the family struggled increasingly to repay. Julian, her father wrote, had grown visibly strained under the pressure, his easy charm replaced by a short temper that alienated even those who had once admired him. Margaret Vale had disappeared from Ashcombe society entirely sometime during the winter, her presence apparently no longer worth the risk to her own reputation, once it became clear the family's fortunes were declining, rather than merely delayed. Eleanor read these letters with a complicated mixture of emotions. She felt no satisfaction in her father's continued struggles, knowing his own health remained fragile, but she could not entirely suppress a quiet sense of vindication when she read of Julian's unraveling composure, of a family finally facing consequences for treating people, including her, as instruments rather than individuals with hearts of their own. Her father's letters also carried, gradually, a change in tone that touched her deeply. Where his early letters had been cautious, careful not to influence her choices, his later correspondence began to reveal genuine pride in the life she was building for herself. "You write of balancing ledgers and helping neighbors settle disputes," he wrote in one letter that Eleanor read so many times the paper began to soften at its folds, "and I confess I find myself prouder of you now than I ever was arranging a marriage I believed would secure your future. I was wrong, Eleanor. I traded your happiness for my own relief. and I have carried that shame every day since you left. Whatever life you build for yourself now, know that it has my blessing, freely and completely given." Eleanor wept reading those words, not from sorrow but from a relief so deep it left her trembling. She had carried guilt over her father's role in her situation for months, uncertain whether he would ever forgive her for the scandal her departure had caused, or whether she could forgive him for the arrangement that had driven her to flee in the first place. His words offered both of them, at last, a path toward healing that neither had dared hope for in those first frightening days after her disappearance. By early summer, Eleanor's life in Millbrook had settled into something she recognized, with quiet astonishment, as genuine happiness. She had built a career from nothing, formed friendships rooted in honesty rather than obligation, and found in Henry Doyle a companionship built on mutual respect rather than convenient arrangement. He had not yet spoken of marriage, understanding perhaps that Eleanor needed time to trust that love could exist without conditions, without hidden cruelty waiting behind a pleasant smile. But his patience, his steady presence, his willingness to simply let her set the pace of whatever grew between them, spoke louder than any premature declaration could have. She had, in the space of less than a year, transformed from a woman whose worth was measured entirely by her usefulness to others, into a woman who understood, finally and completely, her own value. She no longer flinched at the memory of Julian's voice behind that curtain. She no longer measured herself against the life she had left behind, wondering whether she had made the right choice in fleeing before sunrise on that cold morning. One evening in late spring, Henry walked her home along the harbor path after a supper with his mother and sister, the two of them lingering longer than necessary near the water's edge, reluctant to end the evening. The sky had turned a soft gold as the sun dropped toward the horizon, and the fishing boats bobbed gently against their moorings, ropes creaking in the quiet. "You've changed since the day I met you," Henry said, watching the water rather than her face, as though the words came easier that way. "Not in who you are, in how you carry it. You used to apologize before you'd even finished a sentence, like you expected to be told you were wrong." Eleanor considered this, surprised by how accurately he had observed something she had not fully noticed in herself. "I think I did expect that," she admitted. "For most of my life, being wrong, or simply being inconvenient, carried real consequences. I learned to soften everything before anyone else could sharpen it against me." "And now?" Henry asked. "Now I say what I mean, and if it's wrong, I correct it," Eleanor said. "But I no longer apologize simply for existing in a room." Henry smiled at that, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes, in a way Julian's practiced charm never had. "Good," he said simply. "You shouldn't have to." They said little else that evening, but the quiet between them felt full rather than empty, the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed constant conversation to feel understood. Eleanor walked home that night with a lightness in her chest she had not known she was capable of feeling, a happiness entirely separate from anything she had once believed marriage, or family, or fortune could provide. She knew, with a certainty that had taken months of quiet, steady living to build, that she had. The magistrate's dispute, in particular, had tested her in ways her harbor bookkeeping never had. Two fishing families, the Colliers and the Brants, had feuded for nearly a decade over rights to a stretch of water rich with mackerel, each side certain the other had stolen territory that rightfully belonged to them. Records from years past were incomplete, contradictory, and in some cases deliberately altered by fathers and grandfathers long since passed, leaving the current generation to inherit not just fishing grounds but bitterness they barely understood the origins of. Eleanor spent nearly 3 weeks combing through decades of harbor logs, tax records, and old fishing permits stored in the magistrate's cramped archive, piecing together a timeline that neither family had bothered to construct for themselves. She found, buried in a ledger from 30 years prior, proof that the original boundary had been drawn fairly between both families, and that a Collier grandfather had quietly shifted markers during a particularly lean season, a small deception that had calcified over decades into what both sides now believed was ancient, unquestionable truth. Presenting her findings required a delicacy she had not anticipated needing again after leaving Ashcombe Hall, a careful balance of honesty and diplomacy that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the social games she thought she had left behind. But this time, the stakes were real, and the people involved deserved truth rather than performance. She sat before both families in the magistrate's small office, laid out the evidence plainly, and watched decades of resentment finally begin to soften into something closer to understanding. "I imagine neither of you wanted a stranger digging through your grandfather's mistakes," she said gently, when the room grew tense with the weight of what she had uncovered. But perhaps knowing the truth, even an uncomfortable one, is better than continuing to fight over a lie neither of you created. The Brandt family, vindicated by her findings, might easily have pressed their advantage, demanding compensation or public apology for the decades of stolen fishing grounds. Instead, moved perhaps by Eleanor's even-handed presentation of facts that could have been weaponized far more cruelly, they proposed instead a fair redivision of the disputed waters going forward, asking only that the boundary be honestly redrawn rather than punishing the Collier family for a grandfather's long-buried sin. The magistrate himself, an older man named Percival Ashford who had presided over Millbrook's disputes for nearly 20 years, remarked afterward that he had rarely seen a resolution reached with so little lingering bitterness. "You have a gift for finding truth without making enemies of everyone who once believed the lie," he told her. "That's rarer than you might think, especially among people paid to untangle other people's messes." Eleanor carried his words with her longer than she expected to, recognizing in them something she had never received from anyone in her old life: genuine professional respect, offered freely, without any transaction attached. Julian had never once asked her opinion on anything of consequence. His family had valued her only for the land attached to her name. Here, in a cramped magistrate's office smelling of old paper and candle wax, a man twice her age had called her gift rare, and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. It was moments like these, small and unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside, that convinced Eleanor most deeply that she had not simply escaped a bad marriage. She had discovered, piece by piece, an entirely different way of measuring her own worth, one built on competence and honesty rather than beauty and convenience, one that no curtain, no careless confession, no cruel arrangement could ever again take from her. But even as Eleanor settled more deeply into her new life, forces were gathering that would soon draw the two worlds she had kept carefully separated back together, forcing a reckoning neither she nor Julian could have anticipated on that night behind the velvet curtain, when a careless confession first set everything in motion. The letter arrived on a warm morning in early summer, carried by the same discreet route her father had used for months, and Eleanor knew from the weight of the envelope alone that something had changed. Her father's handwriting, usually steady despite his age, trembled slightly across the page. Edward Whitfield wrote that he had fallen seriously ill, a fever that had settled into his chest and refused to break, and that the physician attending him had grown quietly grave in his assessments. He did not ask Eleanor to return. He made no demand, offered no guilt, only stated the facts plainly, and closed the letter with words that undid her composure entirely. "Whatever you decide, know that seeing you build a life of your own has been the greatest comfort of my final years, however many or few they prove to be." Eleanor read the letter 3 times before she fully absorbed its meaning, and then she was moving, packing a small bag with hands that shook despite her efforts to steady them. She found Henry at the harbor within the hour, his boat freshly returned from the morning's catch, and explained in halting, urgent sentences what the letter contained. "You have to go," Henry said immediately, no hesitation in his voice. "Whatever waits for you there, whatever risk it carries, your father needs you now." "I know," Eleanor said. "I only fear what returning might mean. Julian, his family, the scandal I left behind." Henry took her hands in his grip firm and warm. "Then let them see exactly who you've become. You're not the woman who fled before sunrise anymore. You're someone who built a life from nothing, who earned respect through her own work, who has nothing left to fear from people who never deserved her loyalty in the first place." His words steadied her more than she expected, and within the day Eleanor had arranged transportation back toward the county she had fled nearly a year before, her heart caught between fear for her father and a fierce, unfamiliar confidence that had not existed in her the last time she traveled this same road in reverse. The journey felt longer than the memory of her escape, each mile pulling her closer to a world she had deliberately left behind, filled with people who believed she had spent the past year recovering from a mysterious illness rather than building an entirely new existence for herself by the sea. She wondered, watching the familiar countryside emerge outside her carriage window, how her father's household had truly fared in her absence, how deep the Ashcombe family's unraveling had actually gone, whether Julian himself had changed at all in the months since that cruel confession behind the curtain. She arrived at her father's house late in the evening and found him thinner than she remembered, his face pale against the pillows, but his eyes brightened with genuine joy the moment he saw her enter the room. "Eleanor," he said, his voice weak but warm. "You came." "Of course I came," she said, taking his hand and sitting beside his bed. "You are my father, Nothing that happened between us changes that. Over the following days, as Eleanor nursed her father through the worst of his illness, alternating between exhausted vigilance and quiet, tender conversation during his more lucid hours, word spread quickly through the county that Eleanor Whitfield had returned. The story fractured immediately under the weight of her physical presence, healthy and clearly capable, standing in direct contradiction to the months of illness Constance Ashcombe had so carefully constructed for public consumption. Within a week, the truth had unraveled entirely. Servants who had kept their silence out of fear finally spoke freely, no longer afraid of consequences from a family whose own reputation was already crumbling under mounting debts. The story of Eleanor's flight, of the cruel words overheard behind a curtain, of a marriage arranged purely for land and money, spread through drawing rooms and market squares alike, carried by voices no longer willing to protect a family that had shown so little honesty or kindness in return for years of quiet loyalty. Julian Ashcombe, Eleanor learned through her father's careful updates as his health slowly improved, had grown increasingly desperate as his family's finances collapsed further. Without the marriage settlement, without the river access that would have secured their shipping ventures, the Ashcombe estate had begun selling off smaller properties simply to satisfy the most pressing debts. Margaret Vale had married elsewhere entirely, choosing a match with better prospects, rather than remaining tied to a family whose fortunes had fallen so dramatically. Eleanor's presence in the county reignited conversations that had simmered quietly for months, and she found herself, in those first weeks home, navigating a strange mixture of curiosity and admiration from neighbors who had once known her only as the quiet, dutiful daughter, destined for a convenient marriage. Women who had barely spoken to her before her disappearance now sought her out at the market, asking careful questions about where she had gone, what she had done, how she had managed to survive alone in an unfamiliar town without family or fortune to protect her. At first, Eleanor answered these questions cautiously, uncertain how much of her new life she wished to share with people who had, in many cases, stood silently by while her engagement to Julian was arranged without her consent. But she found, gradually, that honesty served her better than the careful evasions she had once relied upon at Ashcombe Hall. "I found work," she told Lady Fenwick, who had once complimented her gown at the very engagement dinner where Eleanor first overheard Julian's cruelty. "Honest work, keeping accounts for harbor merchants in a coastal town. I earned my own wages for the first time in my life, and discovered I was rather good at it." Lady Fenwick's expression shifted through several stages of surprise, before settling into something that looked remarkably like respect. "You kept accounts," she repeated slowly, as though testing whether such a thing were truly possible for a woman of Eleanor's upbringing. "Yourself, with your own hands, for money." "Yes," Eleanor said simply, offering no apology for the admission. "It was the most honest work I have ever done, and I intend to continue it, regardless of what anyone in this county believes such work says about my station." Word of these conversations spread nearly as quickly as the original scandal had, and Eleanor found herself becoming, almost against her own expectation, a figure of quiet fascination rather than pity. Young women in particular sought her out with genuine curiosity, asking what it had truly been like to leave everything behind and build a life through her own labor rather than through marriage or inheritance. Eleanor answered honestly each time, careful never to romanticize the fear and loneliness of those first difficult weeks in Millbrook, but equally careful never to diminish the genuine pride she had earned through her own persistence. Her father's health continued improving steadily through these weeks, the physician crediting both his own treatments and, more quietly, the evident lift in Edward Whitfield's spirits since his daughter's return. He grew strong enough within a month to sit in the garden each afternoon, watching Eleanor manage correspondence and occasional visitors with a composure that had not existed in her before she left for the coast. "You've become someone I barely recognize," he told her one afternoon, though his tone carried nothing but warmth. "In the best possible way. I look at you now and see a woman who knows precisely who she is, rather than a girl waiting to be told. I had to leave to discover that," Eleanor admitted. "I do not think I could have found it here, inside a life already decided for me, before I was old enough to have any say in the matter." It was inevitable, perhaps, that Julian would eventually seek Eleanor out directly, and he did so on a mild afternoon nearly 3 weeks after her return, arriving unannounced at her father's house while Eleanor sat in the garden, reading aloud to her father as he recovered on a chair positioned to catch the afternoon sun. Julian looked different than she remembered. The easy, practiced charm that had once seemed so effortless now sat awkwardly on features drawn tight with stress and sleepless nights. He removed his hat as he approached, an old habit of politeness that felt, to Eleanor's eyes, almost pitiful given everything she now knew about the man beneath the manners. Eleanor, he said, his voice carrying none of its former confidence. I had heard you'd returned. I wondered if we might speak privately. Rod for known. Eleanor glanced at her father, who gave a small, encouraging nod, trusting his daughter to handle whatever conversation followed without needing his protection. You may speak, Eleanor said, rising from her chair, but making no move to walk apart from her father's hearing. Whatever you have to say, you may say it here. Julian's jaw tightened slightly at the public nature of the conversation he had clearly hoped to keep private, but he pressed forward regardless, perhaps understanding he had little leverage left to demand otherwise. I owe you an apology, he said, for what you overheard that night, for the words I spoke about you, which were cruel and unfair and untrue. Untrue? Eleanor asked, her voice calm but edged with something sharper than the soft, accommodating tone she had once used with him. You told Margaret Vale I was convenient, that I bored you, that our marriage was purely a transaction meant to clear my father's debts and secure your family's access to his land. Which part of that, precisely, was untrue? Julian had no immediate answer, and his silence confirmed what Eleanor had already known for nearly a year. I was frightened, he said eventually, his voice quieter still. Frightened of a marriage I hadn't chosen for myself, frightened of the pressure my father placed on me to secure that land by whatever means necessary. I said cruel things because I resented the entire arrangement, and you were simply the person standing closest to my resentment. That is not an apology, Eleanor said. That is an explanation, and a poor one, offered only now that your family's fortunes have collapsed without the marriage you once treated so carelessly. Julian flinched at the accuracy of her assessment, and for a moment, something like genuine shame crossed his features. You're right, he admitted. I would not be standing here offering apologies if my family's situation remained comfortable. I have had a year to sit with the consequences of my own cruelty, and it has changed how I see many things, including you. What is it you want, Julian? Eleanor asked directly, tired of circling the true purpose of his visit. You did not come here simply to apologize for words spoken behind a curtain nearly a year ago. Julian hesitated, then spoke plainly, perhaps recognizing that any further attempt at charm or manipulation would fail entirely against the composed, unshakable woman standing before him. My family needs the settlement your father's land could still provide. I came to ask whether you might reconsider the marriage, now that circumstances have changed, now that I understand more clearly what I nearly threw away. Eleanor almost laughed at the audacity of the request, though nothing about her expression revealed genuine amusement. You threw nothing away that was ever truly yours to keep, she said. I was never a possession for your family to secure through marriage. I am a person, Julian. One you dismissed as boring and convenient, the very same evening you promised to spend your life beside me. I understand your anger, Julian said. I deserve every part of it. But surely, given time, we might build something honest between us, something neither of us had the wisdom to build before. No, Eleanor said, the single word carrying more finality than any lengthy explanation could have offered. I have spent this past year building a life entirely my own, one where I am valued for my mind and my character, rather than the land attached to my family name. I have found genuine respect, genuine partnership, genuine warmth in a place you have never once visited, and would likely never understand. I will not abandon that life to rescue a family whose cruelty drove me away from it in the first place. Julian's composure finally cracked, something like desperation entering his voice. My family will lose everything without this settlement, Eleanor. Please, I am asking you to reconsider, not for my sake, but for the sake of everyone who depends on our estate for their livelihood, the tenants, the servants, people who had no part in the cruelty you experienced. Eleanor felt a flicker of sympathy for the innocent people Julian invoked, tenants and servants who indeed bore no responsibility for his family's choices, but she recognized the argument for what it was, one final attempt at manipulation, dressed in the language of compassion for others rather than genuine accountability for his own actions. Your family's choices created these consequences, she said, not mine. I bear no obligation to sacrifice my own happiness to repair damage your family inflicted upon itself through years of dishonesty and cruelty. If you wish to protect your tenants and servants, I suggest examining your family's spending, your father's investments, and the choices that led you here, rather than seeking a woman you once called boring to solve problems of your own making. Julian stood silent for a long moment, and something in his posture finally seemed to accept the finality of her answer. I am sorry, he said, and this time, something in his voice suggested the words carried more honesty than his earlier apology had. Not simply for what I said that night, but for never once seeing you clearly enough to understand what I was truly losing. I accept your apology, Eleanor said, surprising herself slightly with the sincerity behind the words. But accepting an apology does not mean returning to what it addresses. I wish you well, Julian, truly. I hope you find a way through your family's difficulties, but that way forward does not include me. Julian nodded slowly, replaced his hat, and turned to leave the garden without further argument, his shoulders carrying the weight of a man finally accepting a defeat he had spent months trying to avoid. Eleanor watched him go, feeling not triumph, not cruelty, but something quieter and more complete, the settled peace of a woman who had faced the man who once tried to define her worth, and found, in the end, that his definition no longer held any power over her at all. Her father, who had listened silently throughout the entire exchange, reached for her hand as she returned to her seat beside him. I am proud of you, he said simply. Prouder than I have ever been. Eleanor smiled, and this time, unlike the careful, composed smile she had worn the night she first overheard Julian's cruelty, this one reached fully into her eyes, honest and unguarded and entirely her own. News of Julian's visit and of Eleanor's firm refusal spread through the county within days, carried by servants who had witnessed portions of the exchange and neighbors eager to discuss the dramatic turn the old scandal had taken. Opinion, once divided between pity for Eleanor and quiet judgment of her unconventional escape, shifted decisively in her favor. The Ashcombe family's cruelty, now confirmed by Julian's own desperate visit and the county's growing awareness of their financial collapse, left little room for anyone to view Eleanor as anything other than a woman who had shown remarkable courage in the face of genuine mistreatment. Constance Ashcombe, Eleanor learned through her father's careful updates, had grown increasingly isolated as former allies distanced themselves from a family whose fortunes and reputation continued declining in tandem. Invitations that once arrived weekly at Ashcombe Hall slowed to a trickle, then stopped almost entirely, as county society quietly withdrew its support from a family that had shown itself willing to deceive and manipulate for the sake of appearances. Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction in this social reckoning, though she would not have been human to feel nothing at all watching a family that had caused her such pain finally face consequences of their own making. Mostly she felt relief, a settling of accounts that allowed her, finally, to consider what came next for her own life, without the constant undertow of unfinished business pulling at her thoughts. Her father's recovery continued steadily through the following weeks, until the physician pronounced him well enough to manage his own affairs once more, freeing Eleanor to consider her return to Millbrook, to Henry, to the life she had built with her own two hands, and had no intention of abandoning now that the county's opinion of her had shifted so favorably in her absence. She wrote to Henry each week during her extended stay, sharing news of her father's recovery and the strange, unfamiliar experience of being welcomed rather than judged by a community that had once seemed ready to whisper about her disappearance forever. His replies were steady and warm, filled with small updates about the harbor, about his mother's garden, about how quiet the town felt without her presence, though he never once pressed her to hurry her return or questioned her need to see her father fully recovered before leaving again. It was that patience, more than anything else, that convinced Eleanor beyond any remaining doubt that the life waiting for her in Millbrook was the one she truly wanted, chosen freely rather than settled for out of necessity or convenience. The invitation arrived nearly 2 months after Julian's visit to her father's garden, and Eleanor turned it over in her hands several times before deciding whether to accept it at all. Lady Fenwick was hosting a summer gathering, the largest social event the county had seen since before Eleanor's disappearance, and the guest list, according to whispers already circulating through the market square, included nearly every family who had once attended her engagement dinner at Ashcombe Hall. It would be, Eleanor understood immediately, the first time she and Julian occupied the same room since their conversation in her father's garden, and quite possibly the first time the county's shifted opinion of both families would be put fully on display before witnesses. You do not have to attend, her father told her, watching her study the invitation with an unreadable expression. No one would think less of you for declining. I know, Eleanor said, but I think I want to attend, not to prove anything to Julian, or to Lady Fenwick, or to anyone else who once watched my life be arranged without my consent. I want to attend because I am no longer afraid of that room, and I think it would do me good to know that for certain, rather than simply believing it from a distance. Her father nodded slowly, understanding perhaps better than anyone the significance of what she proposed. Then I will accompany you, he said. If you are ready to face that room, I intend to stand beside you while you do it. The evening of Lady Fenwick's gathering arrived warm and golden, the same kind of summer light that had once filled the ballroom at Ashcombe Hall the night everything changed. Eleanor dressed simply but elegantly, choosing a gown she had purchased with her own earnings from Millbrook rather than anything remaining from her old wardrobe, a small private detail that carried enormous personal significance, even if no one else in the room would ever know its meaning. She arrived with her father on her arm, and the room's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations paused, heads turned. Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some curious, some sympathetic, a few still uncertain how to categorize a woman who had broken every expectation placed upon her, and somehow emerged, by all accounts, stronger for it. She held her composure easily, walking through the room with the same steady grace her mother had taught her years before, though the confidence beneath that grace now came from something far more substantial than careful training. It came from a year of honest work, of genuine friendship, of proving to herself that her worth had never depended on anyone else's approval. Julian arrived roughly an hour into the evening, and Eleanor felt the room's attention shift again the moment he entered, this time carrying an undercurrent of tension that had not existed before his arrival. He looked thinner than he had in her father's garden, the strain of his family's continued financial troubles etched more deeply into his features. His mother, Constance, walked beside him, her once formidable composure now brittle at the edges, her smile carrying the particular strain of a woman working very hard to appear unbothered by circumstances entirely beyond her control. For nearly an hour, both parties managed to avoid direct contact, moving through separate circles of conversation, as though the room were large enough to contain their history, without forcing a confrontation. But Lady Fenwick, whether through genuine oversight or a hostess's calculated curiosity about how the evening's central drama might unfold, eventually maneuvered both parties toward the same refreshment table, and the room's collective attention sharpened as Eleanor and Julian found themselves standing only a few feet apart. "Miss Whitfield," Julian said, his voice carefully neutral, though Eleanor noted the slight tremor beneath his composed greeting. "Lord Ashcombe," Eleanor replied, matching his formality precisely, aware of the many eyes watching their exchange with barely concealed interest. A silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken, until Constance Ashcombe, apparently unable to bear the tension any longer, stepped forward with a brittle smile aimed at Eleanor. "You look remarkably well," Constance said, her tone carrying an edge that suggested the compliment cost her considerable effort. "Considering the illness that kept you away so long." The barb was unmistakable, an attempt to resurrect the fiction Constance herself had constructed months before, but Eleanor met it without flinching, her voice calm and clear enough to carry to the small cluster of guests now openly listening to the exchange. "I was never ill, Lady Ashcombe," Eleanor said. "As I believe you are already aware, I left because I overheard your son describe me, quite plainly, as a convenient arrangement he found boring, moments before toasting our engagement in front of this very county. I chose to build a different life, rather than marry a man who had already told me, in his own words, exactly how little I meant to him." The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere nearby, a glass clinked softly against a table, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. Constance's face drained of color, her carefully maintained composure cracking visibly before the assembled guests she had spent months trying to convince otherwise. "That is not," Constance began, but Eleanor continued, her voice steady and unhurried, carrying none of the anger she might once have felt entitled to, only a calm, unshakable clarity that proved far more devastating than fury could have been. "I do not say this to shame anyone further," Eleanor continued, glancing briefly at Julian, whose face had gone pale beneath the weight of public exposure he had clearly hoped to avoid. "I say it because I am tired of a lie that painted me as fragile and unwell, when the truth is that I left a cruel arrangement and built, entirely on my own, a life I am genuinely proud of. I keep accounts for harbor merchants in a coastal town. I have helped settle disputes that decades of anger could not resolve. I have earned my own wages and my own respect, neither of which I ever received in this county, while my worth was measured solely by the land attached to my family's name." She paused, letting her words settle fully into the silent room before continuing. "I do not need anyone here to validate that life. I only wished, finally, to speak the truth plainly, in the same room where a lie was once told so easily on my behalf." Julian stepped forward then, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "She speaks the truth," he said, surprising Eleanor with the simple honesty of his admission. "Everything she has said is accurate. I said cruel things about her, things I deeply regret, and my family constructed a story to protect our reputation, rather than admit the truth of what happened. Eleanor Whitfield owes no one in this room an explanation for choosing to leave a marriage built on such dishonesty." Constance turned toward her son with visible shock, clearly not anticipating this public confirmation of everything she had spent months trying to deny. But Julian did not retreat from his admission, meeting Eleanor's gaze instead with something that looked, finally, like genuine remorse, rather than desperate self-interest. "I am sorry," he said again. This time, before the entire room rather than privately in a garden, "for everything I said, and everything my family did afterward to protect ourselves, rather than acknowledge the harm we caused you." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, aware of the many eyes still watching, aware that whatever she said next would likely be repeated throughout the county for weeks to come. But she found, standing there in a room that had once decided her entire future without asking her opinion, that she felt no need to perform forgiveness or cruelty for an audience any longer. She simply felt, at last, entirely free of the power either Julian or his family had once held over her life. "Thank you for finally telling the truth," she said simply. "I hope your family finds its way through whatever difficulties remain, but I have already found my own way forward, and it does not require anything further from any of you." She turned then, offering Lady Fenwick a brief, gracious nod of thanks for the evening, and took her father's arm to leave the gathering that had, moments before, threatened to become a spectacle of judgment aimed entirely at her, but had instead become something closer to vindication, witnessed by the very people who had once whispered about her disappearance without ever knowing its true cause. The carriage ride home passed largely in comfortable silence, her father watching her with quiet pride that needed no further words to express itself. "You did not need to say all of that," he observed eventually, though his tone carried admiration rather than concern. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but I wanted to. For too long that room decided what was true about my life without ever asking me. Tonight, I decided instead." In the days following Lady Fenwick's gathering, the county's remaining fascination with the Ashcombe scandal reached its final, inevitable conclusion. Creditors who had waited months for the promised marriage settlement, now certain it would never materialize, moved swiftly to call in debts the family could no longer avoid. Word spread that Ashcombe Hall itself, the grand estate that had once hosted Eleanor's engagement dinner with such glittering confidence, would need to be partially sold to satisfy the family's obligations. Eleanor heard these developments secondhand, through her father's continued correspondence after her return to Millbrook, and found herself feeling something she had not expected, a quiet, uncomplicated sympathy for the tenants and servants Julian had once invoked so cynically in his attempt to win back her hand. Those people, unlike Julian and Constance, truly had played no part in the cruelty that had shaped Eleanor's departure, and she hoped, reading of the estate's decline, that whatever restructuring followed might still preserve their livelihoods, even as the Ashcombe family's fortunes contracted permanently. Of Julian himself, her father wrote only occasionally, noting that he had taken a position managing what remained of the family's shipping interests with considerably less arrogance than he had once displayed, humbled thoroughly by circumstances that had stripped away every advantage he once assumed permanent. Whether the experience would ultimately reshape his character for the better, Eleanor could not say, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she no longer felt invested enough in his fate to spend much time wondering about it at all. Constance Ashcombe, meanwhile, withdrew from county society almost entirely, her once formidable presence at every gathering replaced by a conspicuous absence that spoke louder than any explanation could have. The woman who had constructed such an elaborate fiction to protect her family's reputation now found herself facing precisely the public scrutiny she had worked so desperately to avoid, though Eleanor took no particular satisfaction in observing the outcome from the safe distance of her own rebuilt life. Lady Fenwick, for her part, wrote Eleanor a brief but warm letter in the weeks following the gathering, thanking her for what she called an evening of remarkable honesty, and expressing hope that Eleanor might visit again should her travels ever bring her back through the county. Eleanor read the letter with quiet amusement, recognizing in Lady Fenwick's careful words the particular fascination of a woman who had witnessed genuine drama unfold in her own drawing room, and would likely dine out on the story for years to come. She wrote back a polite, brief reply, grateful for the invitation but making no promises about when, if ever, she might return. She returned to Millbrook within the week, her father fully recovered, and insistent that she resume the life she had built for herself, rather than remain tethered to a county whose opinion, however favorably it had shifted, mattered far less to her now than the quiet, honest life waiting for her by the sea. Henry met her carriage at the edge of town, his expression breaking into open relief the moment he saw her step down onto familiar cobblestones. "I heard," he said simply, having received word through Marjorie's network of traveling merchants long before Eleanor's own letter could have reached him. "The whole county apparently knows now." They do, Eleanor confirmed. And I find, rather surprisingly, that I do not much care what they think of it either way. Henry smiled, taking her bag from her hands as they began walking together toward the bakery where her room still waited, untouched, exactly as she had left it. That, he said, sounds like the woman I have come to know rather well this past year. That evening, as the sun dropped low over the harbor and painted the water in shades of gold and rose, Eleanor sat with Henry on the same stretch of shore where they had first walked together nearly a year before, discussing nothing of particular consequence, simply enjoying the ease of two people who no longer needed to perform anything for each other at all. A tray had been set nearby by Marjorie earlier that afternoon, a small celebration prepared without much fanfare for Eleanor's safe return, and among the simple offerings sat 2 glasses of wine, poured generously by a woman who understood, better than most, how much her young friend had endured to arrive at this quiet, contented evening. Eleanor lifted her glass as the last light of the sun touched the water, and Henry raised his own beside her, neither of them offering grand toasts or rehearsed sentiments, simply sharing a quiet moment between two people who had built something real together, slowly and honestly, without pretense or calculation. She set the glass down after a small sip, the same deliberate motion she remembered from that night so long ago at Ashcombe Hall, when she had set down her own glass and smiled softly at a betrayal that would, in time, lead her toward everything she had never known to hope for. But this smile carried none of the careful performance from that distant evening. This smile reached fully into her eyes, unguarded and genuine, the smile of a woman who had walked away from a lie and found, waiting patiently on the other side of her courage, an entire life built honestly from her own 2 hands. Marjorie joined them briefly as the light began to fade, settling onto the sand beside Eleanor with the easy familiarity of a woman who had watched her transform, over the course of a single year, from a frightened stranger renting a small room above a bakery, into someone the entire town had come to rely upon and genuinely love. "You've done well for yourself, Ellen," Marjorie said, then caught herself with a small, knowing smile. "Eleanor, I suppose I ought to use your real name now, seeing as the whole county already knows it." "Ellen suits me just fine," Eleanor said, laughing softly for what felt like the first time in weeks. "I rather like having earned 2 names instead of 1. The first was given to me. The second, I built myself." "Fair enough," Marjorie said, rising again with a groan about her aching knees, leaving the 2 of them alone once more, as the last light slipped below the horizon. Henry reached over and took Eleanor's hand, his fingers rough from years of hauling nets and ropes, warm and steady against her own. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, not with any anxious need for an answer, simply curious about the shape of the life still unfolding ahead of them both. "Now," Eleanor said, watching the first stars emerge faintly above the darkening water, "I suppose we simply continue. No grand plans, no arrangements made by anyone else on my behalf. Just this, just choosing, each day, the life I actually want, rather than the one someone else decided I should have." "I can live with that," Henry said, and Eleanor heard in his voice the same quiet certainty she had come to rely upon since the day he first noticed an error in his payment, and trusted her enough to point it out, rather than simply accept being shortchanged. They sat together as full darkness settled over Millbrook, the harbor lights beginning to flicker on one by one along the water's edge, and Eleanor thought, not for the first time, of how far she had traveled from that glittering ballroom where a careless confession had once threatened to define the rest of her life. She thought of the woman she had been that night, setting down her glass and smiling softly through a betrayal she had not yet learned how to survive, and she felt, looking back, not anger toward that frightened younger version of herself, but a deep and abiding tenderness for the courage it had taken her to walk away before sunrise, toward a future she could not yet see but had trusted enough to seek anyway. The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the harbor in warm, fading light, and Eleanor Whitfield, once defined only by the land attached to her family's name, sat beside the man who had taught her what it meant to be valued simply for who she was, and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely and completely at peace. 3 years passed, and Millbrook changed the way small towns always do, slowly, in ways barely noticed, until one day the difference became impossible to ignore. The harbor supply office where Eleanor had once untangled Walter Pratt's chaotic ledgers now operated with a second full-time bookkeeper, hired to manage the growing volume of trade that had come to the town partly, though Eleanor would never claim full credit, because of the honest, well-organized reputation the harbor merchants had built under her careful stewardship. Eleanor herself had expanded her work considerably in those 3 years, no longer simply balancing accounts for individual merchants but managing financial affairs for a small cooperative of fishing families who had banded together to purchase a larger vessel, one capable of reaching fishing grounds further from shore than any single family could have managed alone. It was Eleanor who had first suggested the arrangement, having noticed through years of careful bookkeeping how much more the families might earn together than any of them managed separately, and it was Eleanor who structured the agreement fairly, ensuring no single family could dominate the profits at the expense of the others. The magistrate, Percival Ashford, had grown so reliant on her judgment in matters of local dispute that he had begun formally consulting her before any significant ruling involving financial complexity, a partnership that raised eyebrows among more traditional visitors to Millbrook, but had become simply an accepted fact of local life among those who knew the town well. She had married Henry Doyle 2 years earlier, in a small ceremony on the beach rather than any grand church, attended by Marjorie and Walter and the fishing families who had become, in every way that mattered, her true community. Her father had traveled from his estate to attend, his health fully recovered, his pride in his daughter evident in every word of the brief, heartfelt toast he offered at the modest celebration that followed. There had been no velvet curtains at that wedding, no calculated toasts disguising cruel confessions, no glittering crowd more interested in land settlements than genuine affection. There had simply been honest vows exchanged between two people who had built something real together, slowly and carefully, over years of mutual respect rather than convenient arrangement. Henry's boat had grown into a small fleet over those same years, the family business expanding steadily under his steady management and Eleanor's careful financial guidance, and their modest home above the old bakery had given way to a slightly larger house near the harbor's edge, simple but comfortable, filled with the warmth of a life genuinely chosen rather than imposed. They had a daughter now, not yet 2 years old, named Margaret, after Eleanor's own mother rather than any bitter association with the woman who had once laughed softly behind a curtain at Eleanor's expense. The child had Henry's steady dark eyes and Eleanor's quiet, watchful nature, and Eleanor found herself, in raising this small daughter, thinking often of the mother she had lost too young, wondering what advice that woman might have offered about building a marriage on honesty rather than obligation. Of the Ashcombe family, Eleanor heard only occasional news, carried by travelers or mentioned briefly in her father's letters. The estate had been sold in pieces over the years following the scandal, its grand halls divided among several buyers until little remained of the family's former prominence in the county. Julian had, according to the last update Eleanor received, married a widow of modest means from a neighboring county, a quiet, practical arrangement that suited his diminished circumstances far better than the grand alliance he had once assumed was his birthright. Whether he had found any genuine happiness in that marriage, Eleanor could not say, and found, examining her own feelings honestly, that she no longer felt the pull of curiosity about his fate that had once seemed inevitable, given everything they had shared. Constance Ashcombe had passed away quietly 2 winters after the scandal that unmade her family's fortune, her death marked by a small notice in the county paper that drew far less attention than her carefully cultivated reputation had once commanded. Eleanor felt, reading the brief announcement forwarded by her father, not satisfaction, but a kind of weary acknowledgement that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually crumbled under the weight of their own dishonesty, taking with them whatever power they had once held over the people forced to live inside their fiction. Eleanor's father visited Millbrook twice each year now, journeys he had once believed his failing health would never permit him to make, but which had become, in the years since Eleanor's marriage, among his greatest remaining joys. He doted openly on his granddaughter, spoiling her with small gifts and long afternoons spent teaching her the names of the fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, and he had grown close to Henry in a way Eleanor had never quite expected, the two men often disappearing together for hours to discuss matters of trade and shipping that held little interest for anyone but themselves. "I never thought I would find such contentment watching you build a life so far from everything I once believed you needed," her father told her during one such visit, watching Henry carry a sleepy Margaret back toward the house after a long afternoon on the water. "I spent years believing security meant land and titles and the right family connections. You have shown me it meant none of those things at all."
"It meant honesty," Eleanor said, "and people who valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with what I could provide them."
Her father nodded slowly, watching the harbor lights begin to flicker on as evening settled over the town. "I only wish I had understood that sooner," he said, "before I nearly cost you the chance to discover it for yourself. You cannot spend your remaining years apologizing for a mistake you have already spent years correcting," Eleanor said gently, reaching for his hand. You let me go when I needed to leave, and you welcomed me back without judgment when I needed to return. That is more than many daughters in my position ever received from their own families." Their conversation drifted, as it often did during these visits, toward memories of Eleanor's mother, gone now for so many years but still present in small ways throughout Eleanor's own household. In the lullabies she sang to Margaret, in the careful, deliberate way she balanced her family's finances, in the quiet strength she had somehow inherited despite losing her mother's guidance so young. Margaret Vale, the woman whose soft laugh had once confirmed everything Eleanor needed to know about Julian's true feelings, had settled into a comfortable, if unremarkable, marriage elsewhere, her name rarely mentioned in the correspondence that still occasionally reached Eleanor from her old life. Eleanor found she carried no lingering resentment toward the woman, understanding now, with the clarity that only years and genuine happiness could provide, that Margaret had simply been another player in a system that valued convenient arrangements over honest affection, no more responsible for that system's cruelty than Eleanor herself had been for her family's desperate financial circumstances. On a warm evening in early autumn, 3 years almost exactly from the night she had first set down her wine glass and smiled softly at a betrayal she had not yet learned to survive, Eleanor sat once again on the familiar stretch of beach near her home, watching her small daughter chase the retreating waves with the fearless delight only very young children possess. Henry sat beside her, his hair beginning to show the first traces of gray, from years spent working beneath the sun, his hand resting comfortably over hers as they watched their daughter play. "Do you ever think about that night?" Henry asked, watching Margaret shriek with laughter as a wave chased her back up the sand. "The one where everything started, back at that estate." Eleanor considered the question honestly, surprised by how distant that memory had grown, how little power it held over her now compared to the raw, aching wound it had once represented. "Sometimes," she admitted, "though it feels now like something that happened to a different woman entirely. I remember the fear, and the anger, but mostly I remember how frightened I was to leave everything I knew for something entirely uncertain." "And now?" Henry asked. "Now I know that fear was worth walking through," Eleanor said, watching their daughter collapse in a fit of giggles onto the wet sand. "Everything I have now, this life, this family, this peace, it only exists because I was willing to walk away from something safe and cruel, toward something uncertain and honest." Henry pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the water in the same warm gold that had colored countless evenings since Eleanor first arrived in this small town with nothing but a single trunk and a borrowed name. Margaret toddled back toward them eventually, her small dress soaked through with seawater, her face bright with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had never known anything but genuine love and safety. Eleanor gathered her daughter into her lap, feeling the small, solid weight of her, warm and real and entirely hers in a way nothing at Ashcombe Hall had ever truly been. She thought, holding her daughter close as the last light faded from the sky, of the woman she had been that night so long ago, setting down her glass with a careful, composed smile that hid a heart already beginning to plan its escape. She thought of the courage that woman had found, somewhere in the depths of her own quiet desperation, to walk away from everything familiar toward a future built entirely on her own choices. She did not know, that night, what waited for her beyond the estate gates, beyond the borrowed carriage and the uncertain road ahead. She had only known, with a certainty that had carried her through every frightened mile, that the life waiting inside a marriage built on lies was a slower, quieter kind of ruin than any uncertainty the open road might offer. She had been right to trust that instinct. Sitting now on a beach she called home, surrounded by a family built on honesty rather than obligation, Eleanor understood, more fully than she ever had before, that some betrayals, however painful in the moment they first arrive, become the very thing that finally sets a person free. The stars began to emerge above the darkening water, one by one, and Eleanor Whitfield Doyle sat with her husband and her daughter on the shore of the life she had built entirely for herself, and smiled, softly and completely, at everything that had finally, truly, become her own.